Good afternoon, good evening, boa tarde, and welcome to this Dudley Seers Lecture. So I would like to invite Maria Herminia Cabral, representative of the Carlos Gulbenkian Foundation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the President of the Carlos Gulbenkian Foundation, I would welcome you all and express his enormous pleasure at hosting this session here. Dudley Seers suggests that development occurs when a country experiences a reduction or elimination of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, I quote. Indeed, that has always been the Gulbenkian Foundation understanding and implemented in its development practices. One more reason to be delighted at having all of you in this house, which is your house too. The Carlos Gulbenkian Foundation is the result of a great entrepreneur, Carlos Seers Gulbenkian, an Armenian businessman born in the 19th century who built up one of the greatest fortunes in the world, and who considered himself an architect of undertakings. In addition to creating wealth and his passion for the arts, he was a philanthropist who had supported several institutions, and at the end of his life in 1955, in his will he stipulated the opening of an international foundation based in Lisbon with offices in London and Paris. Ever since, the Gulbenkian Foundation has also been an important development partner, mainly in Portugal, the Armenian communities around the world, and in the Portuguese-speaking African countries. Ever since its establishment in 1956, the Foundation has had as priorities the education and training of human resources and support for social sectors such as education, health, arts, scientific research. Combining its grant-giving activities with direct interventions in these fields through its museums, orchestra, corps, and scientific research institute. At the time of the Gulbenkian Foundation launch, Portugal was experiencing a political context of dictatorship and colonial war in an economic scenario of poverty. This was a country with an adult illiteracy rate of over 30% of the population, and where 42 out of each 1,000 babies died in their first week of life. The Gulbenkian Foundation became a space for freedom, respect for diversity, and generating opportunities to access education, culture, and medical care in its various territories of action. The democratization of the political system, the decolonialization, and European integration clearly drove major consequences for the Foundation's agenda and its positioning in the galaxy of development actors across its various intervention geographies. Carlos Gulbenkian Foundation is a perpetual and independent institution, which reflects in its major assets such as time, resilience, and the capacity to take risks, all fundamental ingredients for development. The Foundation has displayed constant concerns over adapting to the times, identifying the problems most afflicting societies and helping to find solutions, many of them innovative and many of them in partnerships with other actors. To maximize our impact, we focus our resources and activities where there is the greatest need and where we are best able to make a difference and produce added value. Following a recent process of strategic reflection, the current two pillars of intervention are equity and sustainability, with differentiated formats, approaches, in keeping with the respective geographic context of its intervention. As may be concluded following this extremely brief introduction to the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation, there is truly every justification for the opening session of this conference, the first ever held in Portugal, to be held here in the home of such an important development partner of Portuguese civil society. I wish you all the very best of sessions and surroundings. Thank you very much.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to welcome you on behalf of CEsA to this Dudley Seers Lecture, which is the first plenary session of the 2023 EADI CEsA Conference. EADI, the European Association of Development Training and Research Institutes, is the largest development studies association in Europe. And its conference, which takes place every 3 years, is also the most important academic meeting on development studies which takes place at European level. This year, my research center, CEsA, the Center for African and Development Studies of ISEG, the Lisbon School of Economics and Management, partnered with EADI to co-organize this conference here in Lisbon, in a year that is especially significant for us insofar as CEsA celebrates 40 years of existence. We do so with the generous support of a number of partners to which we are especially grateful, including Instituto Camões, the Portuguese Development Agency, Tourism Lisboa, King's College London, the Portuguese Foundation for Science and Technology, and of course the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation, which we warmly thank for agreeing to host this Dudley Seers Lecture in this magnificent auditorium. Allow me also to take this opportunity to acknowledge the remarkable work that the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation has carried out for many years in the areas of human development, sustainability, and partnerships for development, particularly with Africa. Its Director for Partnerships with Africa, Maria Hermínia Cabral, who spoke just before me, is a long-time partner and trusted friend to whom we are very grateful and on whom we will continue to count. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the Dudley Seers Lecture, which brings us here today, is traditionally the first plenary session of every EADI conference. Its name pays tribute to Professor Dudley Seers, development economist and pioneer of development studies, who was also one of the founding members of EADI and the first president of this association. Sir Dudley Seers' intellectual legacy is especially remarkable for his broad and plural vision of development, both analytically and in a normative sense, a legacy which continues to challenge and inspire us all. The keynote speaker of this year's Dudley Seers Lecture is Professor Alfredo Saad Filho. He is Professor of Political Economy and International Development in the Department of International Development of King's College, London. With a long and distinguished career spanning academia, activism, and work for international agencies, Professor Alfredo Saad Filho has published extensively on such topics as industrial policy, neoliberalism, democracy and alternative economic policies, the labor theory of value, Latin American political and economic development, among many others. He is the best kind of public intellectual, one who never loses sight of the fact that the point is to change the world for the better. And he is also, if you will allow me a personal note, a longtime friend. Moderating this session, we will have Iliana Olivier, who is Senior Analyst at the Elcano Royal Institute and Associate Professor at the Complutense University of Madrid, She coordinates the International Cooperation and Development Research Area at the Elcano Royal Institute and the Elcano Global Presence Index Project. She is also a member of the Spanish Council for Development Cooperation and Vice President of EADI. So, ladies and gentlemen, we definitely have a lot to look forward to in today's session. Before I leave you, let me just point out that at the end of this lecture, there will be a brief cultural moment, so please stay in this room to watch the performance at the end, and only then we will go for the cocktail. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Well, as you all know, Dudley Seers was very much concerned about the importance of expanding development studies beyond that core little group of West and Central European countries. And in this sense, there is sort of parallelism with Alfredo Saad Filho, who is also concerned with expanding the outreach of EADI, but beyond the North and to the Global South. And this is actually, in addition to everything else, one of his responsibilities as a vice president of the network. There are also other parallelisms between Dudley Seers and Professor Saad Filho. Their intellectual curiosity, something that Alexander just highlighted, and this multidisciplinary approach to development studies, which is also very much at the core of EADI's business, let's say. Seers was an economist concerned about social issues and social basic needs. And Saad Filho is also an economist concerned about political issues at the local level. He has worked on the Brazilian Labour Party at the global level with academic works on global governance and the Global South, but also with working on sociological issues like he has done in his work on mass protests in Brazil. In general terms, both economists were very much concerned had a critical view of mainstream economics that narrows down development to economic development and economic development to GDP growth, and the Washington Consensus. Seers from the structuralist approach, of course, and Saad Filho from a Marxist view of the economic reality. Alexander just highlighted several of his academic achievements. Let me just say that in addition to all of that, materialized in 17 books, 75 journal articles, 55 book chapters, 30 reports and contributions to international organizations. He has published in 24 countries in 15 languages and presented at 300 academic events, 301, and in 35 countries. But he has also contributed to professional reports for different organizations linked to the United Nations systems, which is another proof that beyond and besides his academic work, he works on the transfer to policy making. Just a couple of words on his presentation. This lecture on development studies in an age of crisis is a topic that Dudley Seers probably would have liked and shared. As you know, one important contribution by Seers was his academic address in a forum similar to this one, which was on what is this business of ours. So I guess that, Alfredo, you will enlighten us on what is this business of ours in this time of public crisis. So with no further ado, Alfredo, the floor is yours. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Eliana. Thank you to all my colleagues at EADI, particularly Andy Sumner. I'm deeply honored for the invitation to deliver this year's Dudley Seers Lecture. This is one of the great moments in my professional life, especially now that we have an opportunity to reflect on 40 years since Dudley left us. And this is the period that I'm going to be looking into today. Now, Dudley would be the first person to recognize that the challenges to development that he confronted were quite different from those we have to confront today. His time was a time of very grave dangers in a world that was a post-colonial world divided by the Cold War, but it was also a time of hope, when it seemed that different paths to global convergence were possible. And Dudley explored these paths and their limitations with penetrating insight and a spirit of solidarity with the poor countries. For he was a practical economist with huge experience in the field. He was a man of integrity. He was an academic who genuinely valued and practiced interdisciplinarity. And he was a scholar who chose a heterodox path inspired by structuralist theory that is especially remarkable for being someone from the global north who aligned himself with the most influential, perhaps the first influential social theory to emerge in the global south. And that's where we find Dudley, who is exactly the kind of economist, development specialist, and human being that we miss today. So it's particularly fitting that we should reflect in this light on the current challenges to development, the first of which being the convergence of challenges and limitations that have created a world where the global south and the global north meet and merge in deeper and in more surprising ways than before. This is no longer the dichotomous world of dependency theory, if that ever existed. Now, it is dramatically obvious that we're living in a time of unprecedented crises in the economy marked by a long stagnation punctuated by finance-driven implosions, crisis in politics marked by the erosion of democracy and the rise of fascism, crises in health expressed by the disastrous COVID-19 pandemic, the mental health epidemic, and more, crises in social reproduction leading to growing pressures within our households, crises of the environment with implications for life as we know it, and geopolitical crises that pose another level of threat to life on Earth. And I'm going to look at some of these crises today without any hope of a comprehensive picture. I'll just give you a set of observations that I hope and wish Dudley would have found interesting. But of course, the mainstream denies that there are systemic links between these crises that we experience today. But approaches like my own, and of course Dudley's, would view the world as an integrated whole, in which case these crises can be recognized as being systemically, or perhaps in Dudley's perhaps chosen vocabulary, structurally related. And this is not about some bland generalization on polycrises, which recognizes the multiplicity of challenges, but bypasses the relations of determination between them, implying some kind of shapeless analytical fruit salad. We can do better than this. And to do this, I will start from neoliberalism and from financialization. And the first thing to notice is that they have driven an extraordinary recovery of profits since the lows of profitability in the early 1980s. But financialization has also fueled a vast autonomous sphere of speculation, while finance itself has tended to appropriate a growing share of the total value produced. And I'm going to use the case of the US today for convenience and for generality too. So neoliberalism and financialization have underpinned both the recovery of profitability after the crises of Keynesianism, developmentalism, and Soviet-style socialism, and rising inequality almost everywhere. And I'm going to come back to this later. Now, the next feature of neoliberalism is the transnationalization of production and finance. And this is about the international integration of circuits of capital at the level of firms instead of the level of countries, as was the case before. But very far from leading to global convergence, neoliberal globalization has created new patterns of inequality with immense prosperity benefiting specific strata and the emergence of new forms of deprivation at the same time. Financialization has also created a strong tendency towards short-termism and speculation, declining investment and increasing volatility, despite the unprecedentedly favorable conditions for capital accumulation. The West won the Cold War. The liberalization of trade, finance, and capital movements in most countries, the unprecedented support to accumulation by competing states, the ideological hegemony of neoliberalism, the decline and collapse of most traditional sources of resistance, trade unions, nationalist governments, left-wing political parties, and social movements, the reduction of progressive taxation, transfers, and welfare provision in most countries, the marketization of public services in the name of efficiency and individual responsibility, forcing a growing burden of care into households and particularly onto women. Instead of thriving under those favorable conditions, accumulation has been slowing down, particularly in the core countries. And between 2007 and 2020, the West suffered the longest calamity and the weakest and the most regressive economic recovery on record, that was then followed by the pandemic and now by the current crisis we're experiencing. And this is what I call the economic paradox of neoliberalism, that the achievement of extraordinarily favorable conditions for accumulation has been associated with a complete inability to capitalize on them. Now, everyone knows that GDP growth rates have tended to fall for decades, particularly in the OECD. There's no doubt also that the neoliberal reforms have unleashed strong forces for speculation and growing inequality and against investment, against productivity growth, against good jobs, against economic well-being, and against democracy, with China as a spectacular but only partial exception. The main cause is financialization that has fed a logic of economic extraction and unproductive and unequalizing accumulation that has undermined whatever the achievements were of previous systems of accumulation and led to new stabilization, speculation, stagnation traps around the world. Now, Gabriel Palma shows that if the US had its current GDP, but the same share of income of the top 1% as they did in 1980, that group of people would earn $2 trillion per year less than they currently do. If US distribution had remained as it was in 1980, the top 1% would have only about half its current wealth. The top 0.1%, 1/3, and the top 0.01% would have only 1/5 of their current wealth. This means the top 1% would own $20 trillion less than they currently do. The other side of this coin is the decline in investment. If the share of investment in US GDP had remained stable since 1980, investment would be $1 trillion higher than it is today. And these figures are also from Gabriel Palma. Today, non-residential private investment in the US barely meets depreciation. No wonder the bridges are falling down. And productivity growth has fallen so much that if the US had kept its pre-neoliberal productivity growth rate, its GDP would be $10 trillion higher than it is today. If you look at Germany, that in the early 2000s embarked on a deliberate construction of inequality, including an extremely badly paid working class of perhaps 20% of the population. In doing this, Germany managed to converge not only with Latin American levels of inequality, but also with their collapsing rates of investment and productivity growth. And this tension between inequality and investment exists across the advanced economies in the world today. And this is absolutely remarkable. And this decline in GDP growth since at least 1980, but going back even further, in Western Europe and in Latin America, was entirely due to the collapse of productivity growth, which fell in both regions from over 3% per annum to 0. And this was self-inflicted. Since 1980, labor productivity tripled in Indonesia and in Malaysia, quadrupled in Thailand, multiplied by 5 in South Korea, Taiwan, and Vietnam, by 6 in India, and by 20 in China. In the meantime, the US lost half its manufacturing jobs, and Western Europe lost 1/3. Now, the neoliberal reforms also had, of course, a severe impact on inequality around the world. And again, I'll look at the case of the US in particular as representative of a broader trend in the global north and the global south. And this is a debate, of course, that became famous with the work of Piketty. Now, if you look at the concentration of income at the top, this is evidently mirrored by the decline of the wage share on the other side of the distribution. And the reason for this is the stagnation of real wages. Productivity growth in the United States has tended to be broadly constant, not in other parts of the world, but in the US, yes. But what has happened since the beginning of the 1970s, about late 1972, early 1973, is a stagnation of real wages. So if household median income rises a little bit, even though real wages are constant, that is because of the increasing number of hours worked by members of each household. That is housewives going to the job market, it's retired people returning to the job market, that is students working in order to pay their student loans, etc. And then it's not just that. If you open up the distribution of salaries, you find that the lowest salaries have tended to be stagnant or even to decline, while the highest salaries have tended to increase. So even within the category of wage earners, inequality has increased in the United States. And this is also true if you look at skills levels. The less skills and the less years of education people have, the less well they have tended to do in the job market and in terms of real earnings. And the better off, who were already better off before, have tended to have pay increases, real pay increases over time. This is, of course, a picture of growing inequality within the job market itself. Now, the consequence of that, and in addition, there have been adverse changes in taxation and benefits. The consequence has been a dramatic process of concentration of income and wealth, and that is part of the consequences of the dramatic economic restructuring under neoliberalism. And this economic restructuring has created a very large array of what I call economic losers. Millions of skilled jobs were eliminated, particularly in the advanced economies, not just the US. Entire professions vanished or were exported. Employment opportunities in the public sector worsened because of privatizations and retrenching. Job stability tended to decline, and pay, conditions, and welfare tended to deteriorate. And at the same time, the economic limitations of neoliberalism that we talked about before implied that legitimate material aspirations would not be satisfied, and that for the first time in the history of capitalism, the next generation would not do as well as their parents did. And this is very important because it breaks a generational contract that had helped to validate and legitimize capitalism since the 18th century. We work hard and we sacrifice ourselves, but our children will do better than us. We do this for them. And now it's no longer true. And that has enormous ideological and political implications. Let me have a look at politics now. Now, history shows a variety of paths of transition to neoliberalism. They can be more authoritarian, from Pinochet and Videla to Thatcher and Reagan, or they can be simultaneous with transitions to democracy, as was the case in Brazil, in South Africa, in South Korea, and across Eastern Europe. But through these different paths, a typical democratic political form became associated with neoliberalism in the 1990s. That was the international community that was so discussed at the time. Those neoliberal democracies were heavily circumscribed. In particular, they included an institutional apparatus that was designed to lock in neoliberalism and to insulate economic policy from any form of interference by the majority. That is independent central banks, that is inflation targeting regimes, that is fiscal deficit targets enshrined in legislation, and so on. And those institutional structures, they drastically reduced the policy space of neoliberal states, and with it reduced the space for legitimate opposition. Since there could be no alternative economic policy, there was no choice and no scope to debate the economy. The consequence was that the political space was occupied by tensions. Since you couldn't talk about the economy, the political space was occupied by tensions around culture, around religion, around nationalism, and around racism. And this process of conservative radicalization compounded the alienation of the economic losers. In contemporary neoliberalism, where the collectivity of the workers and class politics have been defeated, the losers have been driven to frame their disappointments, their resentments, their fears, their hopes through the prism of individualism and the prism of ethical conflicts between insiders and outsiders. What we have is the perception that our group of good people is surrounded by predatory non-members. And even within our group, honest individuals like ourselves, we are besieged by dishonest characters. Our values of honesty and hard work are undermined by politicians stealing our money, by immigrants crowding us out of our houses and our hospitals, even though immigrants clean our hospitals and staff them. And that we are surrounded by distant countries stealing our jobs, even though we consume the products that they make. So the political paradox of neoliberalism is that the institutionalization of neoliberal democracy has undermined the foundations of democracy itself. The structures of representation became unresponsive. Public policy became increasingly indifferent to the majority, and the state signaled that class-based collectivities would no longer be recognized, and that cash-poor individuals are either failures or they're crooks. Now, with the previous destruction of the left, those tensions led to a response that was driven, or that has been driven, by anti-systemic forces polarized by what I call spectacular authoritarian leaders, both in the global north and in the global south, but in different ways in each case. And these leaders are supposedly strong people, generally men, who cultivate a politics of resentment, who appeal directly to common sense and claim the ability to get things done by their own force of will, and that promise to defeat a hostile state, a deep state, and to defeat the outsiders who undermine our nation and harm our people. And when they reach power, those spectacular leaders invariably impose policies intensifying neoliberalism under the veil of nationalism and a more or less explicit racism. And their rise is very often shadowed by the growth of fascist movements. So the political crisis of neoliberalism is more than about Donald Trump, who received 3 million votes less than Hillary Clinton, 7 million votes less than Joe Biden. It's not about Brexit that won, or not just about Brexit, that won only at the margin and without any possibility of agreement about what the vote was for. It's not even about the neoliberal leaders, the authoritarian neoliberal leaders today. What we have is a systemic crisis of representation in the system of accumulation. And the paradox of authoritarianism is that the economic and the political crises of neoliberalism promote the personalization of politics and the rise of those spectacular leaders who are committed to neoliberalism and to the expansion of their own personal power, But the radicalization of neoliberalism under those leaders, under those spectacular leaders, harms their own political base. Mass frustration tends to intensify, and those leaders navigate it by creating more resentments and new conflicts. Always a new enemy. You always need that. They cannot stop, because if they did, their popularity would decline, because they do not resolve problems. They only perform for the media. My claim then is that authoritarian neoliberalism is intrinsically unstable. And as the economics and the politics of neoliberalism are corroded from within and destabilized from within, modern forms of fascism are very likely to prosper. And this was the situation in early 2020. What the pandemic did was not to change anything fundamentally, but to intensify those tensions. The economy was not doing badly, then it collapsed entirely. Political systems were drifting towards authoritarianism, and the pandemic led to a situation where those more authoritarian states tended to become spectacularly perverse, and then to impose health policies that killed millions of people and that entrenched COVID-19 so it can never, ever again be eliminated. And the cases of the United States, the UK, India, and Brazil are especially significant in this context. Now, let me look at all this from a different angle. And we have known since Marx that the working class has been separated not just from the means of production, but also from the means of life. It starts with land, but it includes housing, transport, food, and healthcare, with only conditional and mediated access over everything that makes life comfortable and even possible. So under capitalism in general, and under neoliberalism specifically, most people have a fundamental interest in securing access to the means of life, to address and moderate lives saturated with stress, with anxiety, and with unfreedom. 66% of the US population worries about accessing basic healthcare. 31% was struggling to pay their energy bills even before the current crisis. 60 to 80% live paycheck to paycheck. In 2018, 40% of Americans could not cover a $400 emergency expense. The numbers are similar in the UK and perhaps in other rich countries too. Of course, for poor countries, the situation is likely much worse. Nancy Fraser, Tithi Bhattacharya, and Cynthia Arutza have stressed that the global working class includes not only white men working in factories, the majority actually works in the fields, in private homes, in hospitals, in hotels, in delivery services, in restaurants, and in schools. And especially at the low pay and precarious end, the global working class is disproportionately female, migrant, and racialized, and their lives and experiences of these people, that is where the global north and the global south actually meet. Now, capitalism tends to claim as much reproductive labor as possible for free without any concern for its replenishment. And this is especially acute under neoliberalism because low-wage, precarious service work has tended to replace secure, unionized industrial labor in most countries, but particularly in the advanced economies. And we know that real wages have tended to stagnate. And under neoliberalism, the social wage has also tended to decline because services that used to be provided publicly have been externalized into families, particularly particularly transferred mainly to racialized and immigrant women, both within their own households and in the households where they work. And the consequence in the North and the South is that many workers have been forced to take up multiple jobs and to borrow to survive, while they must also take up increasing responsibilities at home. And this has led to a crisis of care that particularly exhausts women, damages families, and strains people's capacities. No wonder we have got a mental today of the story. And these frustrations have fed the right-wing movements that we saw identify real problems in neoliberalism, but then twist grievances to blame poorer countries and the weakest and least protected members of society, and to deflect blame away from capital and profit. On top of all these disasters, we have an economic and political system being overwhelmed by the environmental crisis. Human emissions of greenhouse gases have already raised temperatures by almost 1.5 degrees from the pre-industrial revolution baseline, and current trends suggest that temperatures could rise by 4 to 6 degrees this century, catastrophic for kids that are already born now. Climate change is related to 5 sources of stress in the global economy. First, the contradictions between the limited capacity of the Earth to sustain a stable climate, the unrestrained search for profits under neoliberalism, and the tendency of capitalism to plunder nature for energy and raw materials, and then use the Earth as a free sink for production waste. And this means that carbon emissions are not an unfortunate externality. They are a necessary aspect of accumulation and profitability. And even worse, while the capitalist drive for productivity growth expands our possibilities of consumption, it also implies the increasing use of machinery and raw materials and the generation of more waste. So capitalism intrinsically tends to destabilize the ecosystem. Second problem, the tension between the long-standing awareness of environmental limits to growth, at least since the Second World War, maybe since the 19th century, and the absolute, complete and total inability of governments and intergovernmental organizations to address climate change. So despite all the talk and the endless meetings, CO2 emissions have risen from 20,000 megatons in 1990 to 37,000 megatons last year. Emissions in a small number of advanced economies have declined, but this is more because of their deindustrialization and the relocation of their manufacturing capacity to the global south, which for technological and transport reasons is even worse for the planet. And even if the CO2 reductions in the best performing countries today could be replicated across the entire world, we would still not achieve the targets that were agreed in Paris. Third problem is the tension between the accumulated emissions by the developed Western economies and the rapidly rising emissions in the developing countries claiming the right to development today. There's no diplomatic solution to this problem. Fourth, the structure of the global economy, where several countries are heavily invested in the production of fossil fuels, even though they know that their extraction and processing are unsustainable, but they can't get out. And these tensions have all been intensified by financialization that tends to raise emissions because the financial institutions must pursue short-termist and pro-cyclical strategies that reinforce existing economic structures, that increase volatility, and that deliver profits to those people who already own most resources. And this is incompatible with climate adaptation, with transformative industrial policy, with shifts in the composition of activity, or with the redistribution of income. Now, if climate change is seen from the neoclassical angle of externalities and market failures, then we become automatically trapped in a technocratic logic of exchange that focuses on the correct prices, taxes, transfers, and subsidies. And this may appeal to economists, but it is socially divisive and politically unviable, as was shown by protests in the UK and in France and elsewhere. The logic of exchange also implies misleadingly that climate change could be fixed through a compression of the standard of living of the majority, while profitability should continue to drive pollution, production, and the cleanup. But the vast majority of emissions are not caused by individual decisions, just like the majority of production is not artisanal and it is not for consumption. They are all for profit. Products and emissions, they come from webs of social relations dominated by capital. And it's those webs that determine technologies, energy systems, the output mix, and the dominant patterns of consumption. You cannot opt out of this individually any more than you can opt out of monopoly capital, unless you decide to become a saint or a hermit, and that option cannot be generalized across society. Now, shifting those realities will require more than price changes, more than nudges, more than advertising campaigns. It will demand recognition that climate change has been driven by the pursuit of profits, and this has created a structure of production around the world that is incompatible with climate stability. This is a political problem, not a problem of individual choice. An austerity ecology based on the compression of living standards makes no sense to the majority of the population, even in the advanced economies, not to speak of the global South. And both the majority in the South and in the North have already been living through austerity for decades. The relatively privileged must not preach that those at the precarious end of society should live even worse lives in order to protect the system that has caused the disaster in the first place. Instead, climate activists and the development community ought to build links between environmental struggles and the concerns of the poor, both in production and in social reproduction. There's no doubt that some economic sectors must degrow, particularly luxury goods and the military, but many other sectors must grow. Health, education, public housing, public transport, healthy foods, clean energy, they must all grow. We must grow the number of secure jobs with decent wages. Without these commitments, there will be no viable political path to sustainability. Instead of self-denial, we need to focus on systemic economic restructuring driven by political alliances grounded on the vital interests of the poor majority, so we can build a society based on equality, on material security, and human freedom, together with sustainability. This is about a politics of more, not a politics of less. A politics that shows how we can gain by transcending neoliberalism, and we can gain the possibility of actually addressing climate change, because this will not and cannot be done in the current system of accumulation. I have suggested that the challenges of leaving fossil fuels in the ground, diversifying energy supplies, securing economic sustainability and stability, and improving the distribution of income, wealth, and power, they must be addressed simultaneously for reasons of legitimacy, practicality, and effectiveness. And I have suggested a democratic economic strategy to respond to those imperatives and to displace environmentally destructive acquisitiveness. And those principles of this democratic economic strategy are directly related to 5 areas of debate. The first is that both mass poverty and climate change are urgent problems, and they must be addressed by public policy regardless of cost or profitability. The second is that democratic development must benefit the poor more than the rich. It means that growth is democratic only when it reduces both absolute and relative poverty. Third, a democratic economic strategy must protect the environment and the living conditions of the majority. And to do this, we have to free investment and production from the straitjacket of profits and competition. And instead, investment and production must be socially coordinated to focus on immediate decarbonization regardless of cost or profitability. This is about life or death. Fourth, the goals of a democratic economic strategy have to be pursued directly, and they cannot be conditional on trickle-down profit-seeking, the interests of finance, or anything else. And fifth, the democratic strategy must be nested within a democratic political process. And this idea or this suggestion includes a number of specific policies and modes of finance that I haven't got time to discuss here, but we can talk about them separately. The point is that the costs and the sacrifices that will be involved in the energy transition can gain legitimacy and secure public support only if they are coupled with the reversal of the excluding logic of neoliberalism. And there's no doubt that only the state can implement an alternative economic strategy, because it will be necessary to exercise coercive authority against those people who wish to maintain the status quo. Only the state can deliver the energy transition. Only the state can euthanize the rentiers at last, decommodify social reproduction, definancialize the economy, dismantle the fossil fuel industry, fund a new energy system, and retrofit our mode of living. But no state will do this without massive pressure from below. Only the broad male and female, immigrant and local, racialized and not, manufacturing, service sector, global working class can provide a mass base for this program, and only this global working class has the strategic capacity to disrupt production, to force through the changes that we need to save life as we know it. This is not about moral power and convincing. It's about structural power and forcing through the changes we need. The challenge is to convince masses of people in the North and the South that they have a material interest in restructuring production to make a livable future for their children possible. And this requires the promise of more security now and a more worthwhile life now as a core part of the strategy of change. And the development community has a key role in this process, because through our work and through our interests and our contacts and our expertise, we straddle North and South, and we can help to cross-fertilize experiences in absolutely unique ways. Let me finish. I believe Dudley Seers would agree that development studies must always be critical, especially in times of crises. It should never become an apology for the status quo, for exploitation, for the reproduction of inequality within and between nations, or for the destruction of the conditions of life on earth. Today, we are facing a neoliberal modality of capitalism where prosperity relies increasingly on extraction and fraud, and that is sliding into economic crisis, fascism, and environmental collapse. It is urgent to advance a transformative agenda, and development studies can play a very important role in this. I have suggested that today's crises need to be confronted together through a democratic strategy, and the difficulty here is that any alternative requires new social movements, new coalitions, new structures of representations, from parties to trade unions to community associations, that correspond to the current mode of existence of a society that has been extensively decomposed domestically by neoliberalism, has been imperfectly integrated globally, that has distinct cultures, but that is also imperfectly connected through internet-based tools. We can see important successes in different countries, but we are nowhere near there yet. And there is, and I'll finish on this, there is nothing more important for development studies right now than to support those emerging movements trying to reshape our mode of existence in poor countries and in rich countries too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. So you gave us a very complex picture where the economic, the social, and the political domains are very clearly interlinked. So we can now move on to the questions, to the Q&A session. So if you have a question or a comment, please raise your hand and introduce yourself and be brief. And we will collect maybe 2, 3, 4 questions, and then we will have Professor Saad Filho feedback. So I think there is one first question over there, yeah?
A very good evening to everyone. Thank you very much, Professor. I would want to appreciate the fact that I'm privileged to stand here, or rather to sit down here today and listen to you. I listened and I learned a lot from your speech. I happen to have been studying your works for the past 6 years. I want to quickly mention something that is of interest. It is very true that our profits have been maximized in our society today against the interest, or against the interest of human life. It is equally important that, for us to know that from the last 30 or 40 years till now, the mention has been made severally of poverty, 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 austerity, austerity, austerity. From the days of structural adjustment programs, through the days of the Washington Consensus, up to the days of post-Washington Consensus, it's always been mention being made of how the ordinary poor are suffering from the activities of industrialized nations as well as industrialized systems vis-a-vis global value chains. But little is being mentioned of the growth. It seems as if the theory or the approach to a sustainable living, sustainable earth is being silenced, because most times the priority has always been on the economic benefit of some countries. My question would be, what would be the future of our what would be the future of the development studies in the face of current global crisis, the future of the universe? What of the issue of the growth? How can we promote and regenerate the issue of the growth as well as human welfareism? Thank you very much.
Thank you. There was no.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Jürgen Wiemann, outgoing Vice President of EADI. I thank you very much for this stimulating presentation and the encouragement of the development community to take all these issues seriously and to think about how we can join our activities between North and South in overcoming the problems that we all see. And I would like to subscribe one little aspect I would like to mention, and that is it's convincing to say capitalism is detrimental to the environment, because capitalists have no incentive to take care of the global of the local commons or of the global commons. Now, when we look at our history, I'm looking at the German history. I'm a German. We had the problems of the Ruhr industry area in the 50s and 60s, where we had pollution and everything. So we made it to overcome these problems, of course, with political intervention. Yeah, the Social Democratic Party, Willy Brandt, he campaigned in the 60s with the slogan, let us have a blue sky over the Ruhr area, and we made it in some respects. And there's another aspect with the German unification in 1990. We sadly had to realize how badly the eastern part of our country, the so-called socialist democratic Republic of Germany, had treated the environment. That was really a shock for all of us who thought, yeah, it's capitalism that is doing harm to the environment. But it was this system which had, of course, been in competition with capitalism. Yeah, that was the problem. So they possibly they did not care, because they wanted to overcome us and did not see what they did for the environment. But we have to take this serious. It's too simple to say we have to overcome capitalism and then that will be beneficial for the environment. It's more complicated. We have to look closer to what is going on there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There was another question over there. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Nikki Pauw, University of Amsterdam. I agree with everything you said, but to me, to fully understand the working of neoliberal policies and underlying that a neoclassical economic model is a fuller understanding of the role of technology. what we are witnessing nowadays in many high-income countries, such as in the Netherlands, is financial stagnation. The credit demand of big firms is falling. Why? Because relatively speaking, there is more demand for very highly skilled labor, more AI, digitization of the economy, a small group, but with high rents. And what was formerly high-skilled labor is now, not so skilled anymore. So indeed, wages are dropping. But this lowers the credit demand of firms because hiring people does not require you to borrow money from banks because they are just on the payroll. But the banks want the money to go somewhere. So they try to channel the money through, for example, housing. So we see house prices increasing tremendously. And this effect of the credit demand falling is called financial stagnation. And I think that, understanding the role of technology to me is important in addition to this more political story about neoliberalism. Thank you.
Thank you. There was, so
can I ask? Thank you. My name is Kei Otsuka from Yotarahi University. I have a very short question because I was a bit surprised at the end you emphasized the importance of energy transition and the role of the state. But to me, especially in the global south, the energy sector is where the corporate is so strong together with the state. And there is a sort of movement of corporate sovereignty that the state is actually, following what the corporate decides in the big major oil companies, or they are now investing in renewables. So I would like to know a little bit more about this relationship between energy sector and the state that you emphasize so much, that how do we actually decouple this corporate state conglomerate that we see all over the place? Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe a fifth question for this first round over there, and then back to you, Alfredo.
Thanks, Alfredo. Antonio Andreoni from SOAS University of London. Fascinating talk. I wanted to push you on the last part of your talk when you started emphasizing, of course, actually follows very well from the previous question, the role of the state. And you emphasize different modes of production, different forms of addressing the kind of structural change that we need across sectors and activity. I didn't hear too much about what organizational models you have in mind. And we have actually examples in the pharma industry, in the energy sector and so on. But I would like to know more about what they are according to you, how they could be feasibly implemented in this transition phase. Because of course, mobilizing social movements is one thing, but providing a feasible organizational solution is actually essential in order to have a feasible platform that convinces people about that social mobility element, inequality and so on you discussed. And I'm asking this question in particular in relation to the US case that you emphasized a lot. I mean, all of us as scholars of industrial policy, we've been pushing for industrial policy across many cases, but I would say at the moment, as you pointed out, the Biden emphasis on the IRA and industrial policy is actually completely misplaced to a certain extent, because we are basically financing socially the kind of transition of a highly financialized economy, and a Biden administration has not been so strong against financialization in the most financialized economy in the world. So you could use that as a case, if you want, to give me some examples of how you think an administration like the Biden administration or in Europe, we should actually use industrial policy or different type of instruments to actually start visibly moving in a different direction. Thanks.
Thank you. Also, a couple of very easy questions, Alfredo, on degrowth and the future of development studies. What alternative to capitalism would be necessarily green? The role of technology and energy transition on the evolving capitalism, and the link between social movements and the role of the state. And we still have time for a second round of questions. So yeah, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, this is very difficult. role for development studies in the current phase of global crisis, I think first thing I would say is a recognition of the crises that we have been experiencing. This is crisis for countries, and it's crisis for households, it's crisis for individuals as well. And a position that is a scholarly but also a political position of commitment to equality. And as long as development studies can put these concerns forward and defend those concerns that are political, they are ethical, then we will keep integrity as part of our scholarly position within the social sciences and in the political system as well. This is about not accepting inequality, not accepting differences within countries and between countries, and claiming that we have to move towards a more equal world. And this has to be a fundamental ethical and political commitment of this profession here that we all share. Other than this, we have nothing. Outside of integrity, this type of integrity, we don't have anything, and we don't have a leg to stand on in the debate within the social sciences and in confronting people in the field and in the global north. So I think with those commitments, we can start to have a positive contribution to the most important debates in the world today. Is it sufficient to say down with capitalism? That's clearly, absolutely, completely correct. And I didn't say that. Simply being critical doesn't resolve problems. And we need to have, again, as development studies scholars and as individuals, as academics, we need to have a commitment not just to criticize what exists, but also to the search for positive alternatives. It's not sufficient to do a politics of no, a politics of negativity. If we expect to have the involvement of many more people, and hopefully millions of people in the search for solutions, then we have to have something positive to look forward to offer, to suggest. Because I think the experience is that people don't mobilize just against something. They mobilize in the hope of something better. And that, I think, is in part, and only in a small part, for academics to help to provide. But the solutions to the problems that we have, they will not come from academic conferences. They will come from the cross-fertilization of ideas and from practical experiences of success. And on the basis of many attempts, many defeats, some experiences of success can emerge, and then it's the job of, or one of the jobs of the academic to try and generalize that, because we have the capacity and a little bit of influence to make things, to offer a more systematic analysis of those experiences and then push them forward. It's one of the tiny contributions that we can perhaps offer to these broader movements. Understand the role of technology. I think absolutely correct. There is a tension between a tendency towards stagnation in contemporary capitalism, but at the same time, very substantial technological innovations in particular sectors that in the context in which we live have tended to lead to greater inequality. And you described part of it in terms of impacts in the labor market and then implications for finance. One of the many difficulties of neoliberal financialization has been exactly this, the growing stagnation in the advanced economies, leading financial institutions to move resources to the global south, but very often not resources that will be invested productively, but resources that will end up in speculative circuits. So the speculation that was taking place in the global north and filters down to the global south, starting with the middle-income countries and then going down in the global hierarchies, that's an absolute disaster, because those countries have social and economic needs unattended to a level that is much higher than the level in the global north. So this is absolutely terrible, and it's part of this picture of runaway financialization and the allowance and the regulation of financial institutions towards speculations, towards channeling resources to those wasteful spheres. It is absolutely to be lamented and to be contained to the extent that that we can. How to decouple the energy sector and the big corporates from the state? Maybe it's not an issue of decoupling. Maybe it's an issue of taking them over. Maybe it's an issue of putting those very large, very expensive industries, many of those absolutely unsustainable that have to be scrapped in the very near future and as rapidly as possible. You will need public intervention, public sector intervention to be able to do that. It is absolutely, you're completely correct. The oil industry is the biggest lobby in the world. They have prevented meaningful economic change and meaningful shifts in the energy base of society for decades. They're absolutely negative in their contribution to global warming, and they have to be stopped. And one way to stop them is to expropriate the sector, but then you have to move the sector towards their implosion and the destruction of the physical infrastructure that is already there, which is going to create losses of hundreds of billions of dollars worldwide. We need to do this because the alternative is not having a planet to live in, and very, very shortly. Antonio's question about concrete policy alternatives and institutional frameworks, I cannot answer that. What I can suggest is that the industrial policy of the Biden administration and other industrial policies in Europe and in the UK in particular is the case I know a little bit less badly than other cases, have been framed around public de-risking of private initiatives and the expectation of, or the premise of, private appropriation of profits, whatever the venture may be, and socialization of losses. And that is absolutely impossible, incompatible with sustainability, etc., etc. Formative on a systemic basis. I think to answer this question, you would be in a much stronger position than me to do this. What I can offer is the hope that substantial systemic changes would be possible, and they would require shifts in modes of financing and in industrial structure, which is not what the industrial policy of the Biden administration is looking at. It's looking at national security imperatives as the US government perceives those to be, not particularly at sustainability.
Thank you. So we have time for a second round of questions. I will take 4 additional questions and then one here from the online audience, and then I will give the floor back to Alfredo. Yeah, over there, here.
Hear me? Hi, my name is Matthew Wilhelm Solomon from the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. I wanted to ask more specifically about your case for the integration of expansion of socioeconomic rights with employment, with environmental protections, particularly in the case of Brazil, and if you think it's possible for Lula to integrate these, particularly with the hostile House of Deputies, and at the moment, because it seems, for instance, at the moment with the expulsion of garimpeiros, artisanal miners from Amazon through the military, it doesn't seem that that's a solvable problem unless there's employment creation for the garimpeiros or for the system that is producing artisanal informal working. And just, is it possible for Lula to do that? And if so, what are the conditions?
Thank you. There was another.
Thank you. I don't know. Sorry. My name is Ramon Balcázar. I'm from Chile. I'm an activist and a PhD student in rural development. My work and all my work is basically based or focused on the extraction of lithium in the Atacama Desert, which we kind of place into a context of green extractivism. So when you speak about the need of degrowth or growth itself, we from Latin America see that the growth is possible thanks to colonization, occupation, dispossession, and of course, the extractivist model of countries like ours. So what we see today is how corporations and the most pollutant countries in history and in present day are actually taking over the climate agenda. And you actually mentioned the challenge of for the climate movement and the development practitioners to push change towards the needs of people, but how the academia actually can learn from social movements and from Latin American academia not to fall into the trap of green development or green growth today, which will cause actually the expansion of the extractive frontier in our countries and territories. Thank you.
Thank you. Over there.
Good evening. Thank you so much. My name is Terry Obestole from the University of Agda in Norway, but I also come from Zimbabwe. And thank you so much for the lecture. I would want to ask a quick question, but it's also a follow-up from what you have said from the previous responses. So you talked about a proposal of having new solutions to the challenges that you've highlighted here. But I wanted to ask about the feasibility of some of the solutions that have been proposed. We've emphasized about the role of technology, and we all agree that yes, it could be central in fixing some of the challenges that we have. But how do we see the feasibility given the digital divide? How do we ensure that the world moves together? Because there are some areas which I can tell you for sure that technology will remain a pie in the sky, at least at the given moment. Then also the other thing that I would want to ask about, it's part of the solution that you've proposed is the growth of more social movements. I also wanted to ask about the acceptability of such movements in other areas where we've got a growing tendency of repressive regimes. How do you see that happening in such circumstances? So yeah, it's more around feasibility of some of the proposed solutions, which is the thing that I'm asking for. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question over there.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah. So my name is Chris Buscher. I'm from the University of Turin. Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture here. So as long as I know your lectures, you've been analyzing inequality. And now I just started this book by David Wengrow and David Graeber, the latest book about well, new interpretation of history. And one of the things they start with is inequality. Where does inequality come from? And they actually say like inequality has been subject to corporate capture itself, actually. So everybody now is talking about inequality, including in the World Economic Forum and all kind of corporate actors. And I was wondering, how do you look at that, if you agree with that at all? Do you see it as a summum of capitalism's capability of incorporating critique, so to say? Or is it maybe a positive trend? But then we have to look at the analysis, of course, what produces inequality, I was wondering. Thanks.
Thank you very much. One additional question from the public. Yeah.
My name is Doreen van Noorn. I'm from the Netherlands. I work in government and partly as an academic. I study philosophies of the Global South. My question is actually twofold. How do you see that democracy is going to solve the problem if capital controls most of the main institutions, including media? And my second question is, when do you see the next global financial crisis happening, just like the one we had in 2007 and 2008?
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ksenia Bukshina. Not me?
Just a second, because could you repeat? You missed the second part of the question. Could you please repeat the last part of your question?
See the next global financial crisis happening, just like the one we had in 2007, 2008, because the bubble was never really solved.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting. My name is Ksenia Bukshina, and I'm from Ukraine, and I will ask the question about my country. And actually, I want to ask about the positive change and the opportunities you already mentioned. So it all looks quite pessimistic. And we all understand that like we have the work to do, but if you have the ideas on what opportunities are there, because What we see, for example, now in Ukraine, we see the like absolutely fantastic rise of the civil society, fighting the social problems, helping the army, doing all the best they can. We see the real approach and coming to the gender equality or even gender justice, I would say, because we already have 60,000 women in the army, and they are already there. So we don't anymore say that men are fighters and women stay at home and protect. So we all fight equally. And I would be really happy to hear like what opportunities, maybe more big, you see in the not only local perspective, but from the world's one. And if you have ideas on Ukraine and the things the academia, for example, can pay better attention to, or the country can really promote some things to the world to speak also for such communities, I would be happy to hear the ideas, and thank you very much.
Thank you. And just let me add one final question from the online audience on how do you see the alternative project of decolonization within or alongside your critique of the political economy of neoliberal capitalist development? So that would be it, Alfredo.
This is only getting more difficult. In no particular order, the Lula government and the problem with garimperos in the or the artisanal or industrial miners in the Amazon, is the problem solvable? I don't think it is solvable 100%, but it can definitely be improved as it has been improved. And the resolution to a problem like that one involves taking people out. You have to take the miners out of indigenous areas. You have to take them out of the federal areas in the Amazon. You have to take them out of those regions where they have been polluting the water with mercury and absolutely devastating the local environment. And it is that you just absolutely have to do. Now, there's a whole social problem. What are these people going to do with their lives, and sources of earnings, and the problem in the labor market, and where do they come from, and the connections between those individuals who are working there and big capital, including finance capital based in Sao Paulo, which is financing those engines because these were not bought by those people with their savings or with the federal benefits that they receive in the households. These are capitalist enterprises, or there are capitalist enterprises behind them. But the point is, right now, they have to get out. So the use of the federal police and the army to do that is absolutely legitimate. Now, the difficulties of the Lula administration go way beyond that, and quite rightly, as you said, the room for maneuver of the new administration is extremely narrow, because Congress is the most right-wing Congress ever elected in Brazilian democracies over the past 40 years or so, and because of the way politics functions in Brazil, a highly fragmented political system with 20, 30 political parties with representation, no political program to speak of, the vast majority of them, and only economic interests, both private and collective, to the forefront. So for Lula to survive and complete his administration, to be extremely brief, he will need a turnaround in the economy. But this is something that him as president or the Workers' Party or whatever will not be able to deliver. It depends on the global economy. So I'm only mildly optimistic, but wow, it's so much better to have this problem than to have the problem that Brazil had until last year under Bolsonaro, for God's sake. Green growth and green extractivism. I would be interested to read your PhD, because I think this is an absolutely fantastic topic and super current in the way. And if you think of Elon Musk's position on the coup in Bolivia, for example, there's an absolutely horrendous political approach to the problems of green growth in Latin America, but also the domination of big corporates on extractivism, the entire chain of activities of the Tesla that you buy and think that you're saving the environment. You're not. So wonderful. Please, let's keep in touch. feasibility, I'll leave the feasibility of solutions for a moment. The Graeber book, I have not read that book, but if you think 10 years ago when Piketty launched his book Capital in the 21st Century, I hadn't read that book, now I have. I hadn't read that book, and I realized that there was something going on, and some of you may have a similar experience. I was having a dinner party with a couple of friends. He was a retired chemical engineer, and she was an occupational therapist. And they had bought the book, and they were reading that book. Now, it's a thick book, right? And it's a boring book. It's a book for economists. Why were they reading that book? And then I saw that book on tables in bookshops at an airport. It became a classic because it hit something that people were feeling. And even if you wouldn't understand the book, and in fact, Amazon tracks, right? If you buy the book on Kindle, Amazon tracks how much you read. And the vast majority of people who bought that particular book on Kindle never went beyond the introduction. Of course, it's a boring book. It's a book for economists. Now, the book still, with all these adverse aspects to it, the book captured the moment. And I think it was the moment when people realized that neoliberalism not only had not fulfilled its own promise to bring stability, prosperity, efficiency, etc., it had just brought a few years before the biggest economic crisis since 1929. It lost legitimacy. And I think Piketty's book captured that moment. There's something wrong about this thing that not only creates instability, volatility, etc., but it is also perverse from the point of view of distribution. So yes, capitalism does incorporate a lot of criticism to itself, but it can be challenged too. And at a certain point, it loses, cracks, the legitimacy cracks, the ideological hegemony goes, and then different narratives are possible, different interpretations of the world. And we are experiencing a moment like this. At this moment in time. Will democracy resolve the problem? Democracy has a problem. Democracy is backsliding in a large number of countries around the world. Domination of media oligopolies, domination of the billionaires who are increasingly prosperous, and it's absolutely scandalous to look at the data on the prosperity of the billionaires compared to the impoverishment of the majority of people. So can democracy resolve the problem? Well, hopefully, yes, but we do need to resolve the problem of democracy, first of all, through mobilizations to restore accountability of the state, to restore the value of citizenship, to restore the role of the citizens in states where that role has been lost, and much more in states where that role didn't exist to begin with. Where's the next global crisis going to come from? I have absolutely no idea. If I did, I would not be here. I'd probably be making money on crypto. But the difficulty with that is that the system is absolutely bloody unstable. And if you think back to 2006, and I remember myself, very humbly, thinking back then, my God, this thing is not possible. It's absolutely not possible. And you must all have had the similar, well, those who have the enough age, as I do, they think the same thing back then. The United States importing much more than it exports and then sending money to China that then invests in the United States in buying paper. How long can this thing last? This is wrong. It's going to crack. And then when it did crack, nobody was expecting. So we don't know. It's going to surprise all of us. That's the way it happens every time. But there will be another crisis. And the way that the 2008 crisis was resolved, and then the way the pandemic or the economic catastrophe accompanying the pandemic was averted, was through more financialization. So the entire pyramid of financial assets in the global economy is much bigger than it was before. Some aspects of it are more stable, but on the whole, it cannot go on like this. The last time I said that was in 2006. I'm not predicting anything. I'm just looking at this. This is a kind of an inverted pyramid. This thing is going to topple down at some point in ways that we cannot imagine. So interesting things will happen, not all of them interesting in a good way. Feasibility of solutions. It's very difficult to ensure that social movements move together. And this is a debate that has been out there in social movements and political movements for decades, if not centuries. Country circumstances are different, traditions of organization are different, degrees of capacity and capacities of mobilization are different. Portugal has a history that is extraordinarily rich and vivid compared to the UK, that is an absolute basket case, or other countries around the world. So realities will be different, but some form of international articulation is both essential and more possible now than it was before, because of new forms of communication that have evolved, because people move around much more than they did before, etc., etc. Somebody has to start, and the way to start is to do whatever you can. And then you're setting the example for other people elsewhere to copy, to learn from, to do what they can. But what is essential now is to do what you can quickly. We do not have much time. And even in the best scenario, I think the consequences are likely, very likely to be extremely severe for our generation, but especially for the generations following us until the beginning or until the end of this century. So mobilization, and then moving on to the final questions. I absolutely know nothing to contribute on the specific issue of Ukraine, but I thought it was extremely interesting what you said about self-mobilization. And this is what social movements, or the history of social movements, shows us. That things are really moving when nobody's in control. And when things are popping up everywhere with different solutions, different alternatives, different kinds of experiences, and you only hear about them when it's late. Wow, it has already happened. Whoa, somebody is doing something that you had no idea about. And in the beginning, you think you know what's going on because you've been involved in social movements for a very long time, and you're doing the little work of talking to people and trying this and trying that. And then suddenly, boom, something happens, and that is what used to be called in the good old times a revolutionary moment. When nobody is in charge, something is happening and people are moving more or less jointly towards a common objective. So this mobilization being about creativity, I think this is absolutely essential. And the decolonization. Decolonization is essential, but it has been understood in very different ways. It has been understood in a particular way within academic debates. It has brought very interesting concerns to the front. Let's not just study dead white males in our courses when you teach whatever subject it is in the university. Let's look for new experiences. Let's look for what people in the Global South are trying to do. They have experiences that are valuable and they can teach us something new, instead of us just repeating and replicating things that have been done before in the metropolis. So yes, absolutely valid, but not as tokenism, not as a duty, but as a recognition of valid experiences that are taking place that we don't know about. It's part of this mass creativity and self-mobilization. Let's learn from what's actually happening on the ground. I think that is immensely satisfying for all of us. I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So thank you, Professor. This is the end of this lecture, of this Dudley Seers lecture, and thank you also to the audience in the room and to the online audience too. Thank you so much.
Hi. I'm Luis Ma. I'm also one of the organizers of this conference. So we're just going to have a very brief music moment before we head for the drinks. So after you leave the room, on the right side, you have the drinks. And I would like to call, I think they're trying to open the door to come in. It's the Body Repercussion Orchestra. It's a group of young people, and they basically want to tell everyone that you can make music with your own body. So they will come in. So let's see if they're coming now. So it's going to be like 10, 15 minutes, and then we go for the drinks. Thank you. I'm just waiting for someone to open the door. They can't get in. Come.
Cantar um tango, tocar um tango, para balar um tango.